The Caldermore Palace ballroom blazed like the inside of a jewel box on the night of the royal midsummer ball. 800 candles burned in the crystal chandeliers overhead, casting everyone below in a warm, honeyed glow that made ordinary people look extraordinary, and extraordinary people look like gods. The polished marble floor reflected the dancers, like a second world trapped beneath their feet. A world of swirling silk and deep emerald, wine red, and midnight blue. The scent of hothouse roses and warm champagne drifted through the air, and somewhere near the gilded gallery above, a string quartet played a waltz so precise and so effortless it felt like breathing. Lady Seraphine Colt stood at the center of all of it, one gloved hand resting on the arm of the most powerful man in the room. She wore ivory satin with pearls threaded through her dark hair, and she smiled the smile of a woman who believed, truly believed, that everything she could see was already hers. Her other hand touched the Duke of Ashenvale's sleeve as if marking him, as if daring anyone in the room to say otherwise. No one did. No one ever did when Duke Alaric Vane was in the room. Duke Alaric Vane was 41 years old, tall, and built like a man who had never once doubted his own reflection. His jaw was sharp, his dark eyes calculating, and he wore his formal military-cut coat with the practiced ease of someone who had been dressed for power since birth. He was charming when he needed to be, and cold the rest of the time. And he had learned long ago that in this world, cold was more useful than warm. His family's estate, Ashenvale Hall, 4,000 acres of rolling Hampshire countryside, had tripled in value under his management. Or so he told people. Tonight, he was smiling more than usual. There was good reason for that. In exactly 20 minutes, he planned to walk to the center of this ballroom, request the quartet's silence, and announce his engagement to Lady Seraphine Colt. It was a perfect plan. He had been building toward it for 2 years. He had cleared every obstacle. He had made sure of it. His first Duchess was dead. He had the paperwork to prove it, or rather, he had the paperwork to say so. And paperwork, in Alaric Vane's experience, had always been easier to control than people. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened at 11 minutes past 9. Most guests barely noticed. People arrived late to these things. It was expected, even fashionable. But the footman stationed at the door noticed. He noticed because the woman who stepped through those doors did not walk the way guests walked. She did not pause at the threshold to be announced, to smooth her gown, to search the room for familiar faces. She simply walked in, as though she had been here 1,000 times and had every right to return. She wore silver. Not pale silver, deep silver, the color of a winter sky an hour before dawn. A gown that caught every one of those 800 candles and held the light without releasing it. Her auburn hair was pinned at the base of her neck, simple and severe, not a strand out of place. Her skin was paler than it had once been, and her cheekbones stood out sharper, as if the last 2 years had carved away everything soft and left only what was necessary. She paused just inside the doors, long enough for one person to see her, and then another, and then the entire room began to understand that something was terribly, beautifully wrong. The whispers started like fire in dry grass, small, quick, unstoppable. A countess near the refreshment table grabbed her companion's arm. 2 gentlemen near the terrace doors turned from their conversation and stared with expressions that mixed recognition and horror in equal measure. An older woman in black, the Dowager Marchioness of Telford, who had known the Duke's family for 30 years, pressed her gloved hand to her mouth. She had attended the memorial service. She had seen the flowers, heard the eulogies, signed the condolence book with her own hand. The name that moved through the room was spoken in stages. First a question, then a disbelief, then a realization that landed in each new person like a stone in still water. Is that, it can't be, the Duchess of Ashenvale? But it was. Anyone who had ever seen Isolde Vane, truly seen her, past the role and the title and the careful performance of a duke's wife, recognized her now. Not because she looked the same. She did not look the same at all. She looked like a woman who had survived something and had come back not to forget it, but to make certain it was never forgotten. The music played on, briefly. Alaric heard the shift before he understood it. 800 conversations did not stop at once. They slowed, the way a river slows when something enormous enters the water upstream. He felt Seraphine's hand tighten on his arm. Then he heard the name, close enough to catch. The Duchess. He turned. And for the first time in his adult life, the color left Duke Alaric Vane's face entirely. He stood absolutely still for 3 seconds. Then his eyes, trained since boyhood to assess a room, to find the exits, to calculate odds, began to move. The terrace doors to his left were 12 feet away and currently unblocked. The corridor behind the musicians' gallery connected to the east wing. The east wing had a servant's passage that led directly to the stable yard. He had used it before, years ago, when a situation had required quiet disappearance. His body made the calculation before his mind finished making it. He pressed Seraphine's hand from his arm and took a single step toward the terrace. Then he stopped, because Isolde was already looking directly at him from across the entire length of the room, and she was not running. She was walking toward him. Isolde Vane walked through the crowd the way water moves through stone, not forcing anything, simply going where it needed to go. Guests stepped aside without fully understanding why. Perhaps it was the stillness in her face, the kind of stillness that is not peace but something harder, something forged. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, back straight, chin lifted, neither aggressive nor tentative, as if this moment were simply the next logical step in a journey she had planned very carefully for a very long time. She did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Seraphine Colt, who had gone rigid as a candle beside the man who had placed her there. She looked at Alaric. Only Alaric. The distance between them closed with each step. 20 feet, then 15, then 10. The string quartet had stopped playing somewhere around the 15-foot mark. The room had fallen into a silence so complete that the only sound was the soft brush of Isolde's silver gown against the marble floor. Alaric took another step toward the terrace doors. Then another. His mouth was moving, perhaps rehearsing an explanation, but nothing was coming out. He looked, for the first time in his life, like a man who was afraid. She stopped 6 feet from him, close enough that he could see her eyes clearly. They were the same gray eyes he had looked into on their wedding day 7 years ago. The same gray eyes he had watched dim with confusion and pain as the months of their marriage darkened into something unforgivable. But there was nothing dim about them now. They were the clearest, steadiest eyes in a room of 800 people, and they were looking at him the way a judge looks at a man who has already been found guilty. The room waited. Seraphine waited. The footmen, the dowager, the ministers, and their wives, the lords and the ladies who had attended the memorial service and signed the condolence book, and whispered amongst themselves about what a tragedy it was. They all waited. Isolde let them wait. She had waited 2 years. She could afford another breath. Then she did something no one in the room expected. She smiled. Not a warm smile, not the social performance of a duchess greeting guests. Something quieter, something that said, I know everything. I have always known, and now so will they. She opened her mouth to speak, but Duke Alaric Vane chose that moment to run. 7 years before the night of the ball, Isolde Hartwell had been 24 years old and entirely unimpressed by Duke Alaric Vane. She had met him at a garden party at Brentwich Park, the Derbyshire estate of a mutual acquaintance, on an afternoon so gray and damp that the roses along the terrace wall hung their heads in defeat. She had been wearing her second-best dress, pale green wool, a little short at the cuffs, and she had been deeply occupied with avoiding the host's eldest son, who had twice tried to corner her behind the conservatory. She had therefore been standing somewhat purposefully near the far end of the rose garden, watching a robin argue with a worm in the wet grass, when she became aware that someone had come to stand beside her. She looked up. He was tall, dark-haired, and carrying 2 cups of tea in a way that suggested he considered this slightly beneath him. He held one out to her without preamble. You look as though you were trying very hard not to speak to anyone, he said. I am doing the same. We may as well suffer together. It was the most honest thing he ever said to her. The courtship moved quickly. Alaric was attentive in those months. Not warm, exactly, but present. He remembered things she said. He sent books she had mentioned wanting, not flowers. He listened when she spoke about the small school she had helped organize on her family's Norfolk estate. And he did not tell her it was charming in that particular tone men used when they meant small and harmless. He asked her opinion of things and appeared to consider her answers. She had not expected to love him. She was not certain she ever did entirely, but she trusted him. That was the thing she came back to years later, in the low-ceilinged cottage on the Scottish coast, with only the sound of the sea outside and a single candle burning on the table. She had trusted him. She had believed him to be a man of principle, the sort who kept his word because he felt the weight of it, not because he feared the consequences of breaking it. She had been wrong about him in every direction. But on the afternoon he proposed in the garden at Brentwich Park, with the rain starting again, and his voice perfectly steady, she had said yes, and she had meant it. Their wedding took place in the chapel at Ashenvale Hall on a cold November morning, with a pale sky and bare trees, and 27 guests, none of whom were surprised. Isolde had walked down the aisle on her uncle Lord Cormac Hartwell's arm. Her parents had died when she was 16, a carriage accident on the Norwich Road. And she had looked at Alaric waiting at the altar and thought, this is a beginning. He had looked at her steadily as she approached, and there had been something in his expression that she took for gravity, for the seriousness of a man who understood what he was committing to. She understood later that it was calculation, that even as she walked toward him on that November morning, he was already managing the variables. She was 24. She had no parents. She had a modest inheritance that would, upon marriage, pass under his legal authority. She had a gentle nature and a trusting disposition and a habit of seeing the best in people that he had identified within the first week of their acquaintance as the most exploitable thing about her. She said her vows. He said his. The bells rang, and Isolde Hartwell became Isolde Vane, Duchess of Ashenvale. The first year was not unhappy, not exactly. It was merely quiet in ways she had not anticipated. Alaric was absent more than she had expected. London, he said, business with solicitors and tenants, and the various obligations of the dukedom. And when he was home, he was present in the way that a piece of furniture is present. He ate his meals. He sat in the library. He met with his estate manager, a man named Grafton, whose eyes never quite met hers. He was not unkind. He did not raise his voice. He simply lived beside her as if she were a particular arrangement of the room that he had accepted, but not chosen. Isolde filled her days with purpose. She organized the household, corresponded with the parish school, visited tenants in their cottages with baskets of food when the autumn harvest was poor. The tenants liked her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ballow, liked her. Even the dogs, two elderly spaniels who had been Alaric's mothers and who viewed all newcomers with suspicion, eventually conceded to let her scratch their ears. The Duke did not appear to notice any of it. He was too busy with the accounts. It was the accounts that changed everything. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of revelation, no document spread open on a desk, no letter dropped and caught mid-fall. It happened slowly, the way understanding almost always happens when we do not want it to, in fragments, in small irritations that refused to disappear. Isolde had no formal training in estate management, but she had grown up watching her uncle, Lord Cormac, run his property in Norfolk with meticulous care, and she had absorbed, without intending to, a sense of how numbers ought to move. She began reviewing household accounts in her second year at Ashenvale Hall, not out of suspicion, simply out of the need to feel useful. And the numbers she found did not move the way she expected. Payments to tenant accounts that did not appear in the corresponding ledgers. Entries for works on the cottages in the South Field that, when she walked out to look at them, had plainly not been done. Figures transferred quarterly to a private account listed under a name she did not recognize. She made notes. She said nothing. She checked again. The numbers did not improve. They were worse. She confronted him on a Tuesday evening in March, in the library after supper, with her notes laid out in a careful row on the desk between them. She had rehearsed what she would say. She had tried to frame it charitably. Perhaps it was a bookkeeping error. Perhaps Grafton was at fault. Perhaps there was a system she did not understand. She said all of this, offering him every reasonable exit. Alaric looked at her notes for a long time without touching them. Then he looked at her. And in that moment, just for 1 second before the mask came back, she saw something in his face that made her stomach drop. Not guilt, not surprise, something colder. The look of a man recalculating. "You have been misreading the ledger system," he said finally, his voice perfectly even. "I will have Grafton explain it to you. You needn't concern yourself with this." He swept her notes from the desk with one hand, gathered them without looking at them, and placed them in the fireplace. He did it so naturally that she almost believed him. Almost. She was still watching the paper curl and blacken when he left the room. She did not sleep that night. She knew. Within 3 weeks of that Tuesday evening, Isolde began to feel unwell. At first, she thought it was the season changing. The March damp had settled into the hall in a particularly unpleasant way that year, creeping under doors and gathering in corners. But the dizziness was unlike anything she'd experienced before. It came in waves, unpredictable and disorienting, and it was followed by a trembling in her hands that made her teacup rattle against its saucer when she lifted it. She began to drop things. She began to lose track of conversations mid-sentence, searching for words that had been perfectly available a moment before. She mentioned it to Mrs. Ballow, who looked at her with an expression that Isolde could not quite read. She wrote to her Uncle Cormac, who replied with concern and offered to visit. She did not write to Alaric, who was in London. When he returned, he did not ask how she was. He arrived with a doctor, man she had never met, with small eyes and very clean hands, who asked her questions in a voice that presumed the answers. Dr. Prewitt. She did not trust him from the first moment she saw him. She was right not to. Dr. Prewitt stayed at Ashenvale Hall for 4 days. In that time, he examined Isolde twice, each time with the brisk efficiency of a man confirming something he already believed. He asked about sleep. She slept poorly, but she always had. He asked about appetite. It had diminished since the dizzy spells began, but that seemed natural. He asked in a tone carefully designed to suggest the question was routine, whether she had been experiencing disturbances of the imagination. She said she had not. He wrote something in his notebook that she was not permitted to read. On the morning of the 4th day, he spoke to Alaric in the library for 40 minutes with the door closed. When Alaric came to find her afterward, he sat across from her in the drawing room with his hands folded and explained quietly and reasonably that Dr. Prewitt believed she was suffering from a nervous condition aggravated by the stress of managing a large household. It was not unusual in women of her temperament, he said. There was a tonic that would help. He produced it from his coat pocket as he spoke. A small, dark bottle, neatly labeled. Prewitt's Restorative. She should take 15 drops in warm water each morning. She took it. Of course she took it. She was frightened, she was unwell, and the man sitting across from her was her husband, the person whose job it was to take care of her. The tonic tasted of anise, and something faintly bitter beneath it that she could not identify. She took it every morning, as instructed. Standing at the window of her dressing room in the pale northern light, 15 drops in warm water, and she waited to feel better. She did not feel better. The dizziness continued. The trembling worsened. By the end of the first week on the tonic, she had begun to experience moments of confusion so profound that she would find herself standing in a room with no memory of having walked there. She would look at a familiar object, the blue vase on the mantelpiece, the small painting of the Norfolk coast that had been her mother's, and feel a terrible sliding sensation, as though the thing she was looking at was real, but she was not quite real enough to match it. She told herself it was the illness. She told herself the tonic simply needed time to work. She told herself that Alaric would not hurt her. She was wrong on all 3 counts, but she did not know it yet. She only knew the bitterness on her tongue each morning and the growing terror that she was losing her mind. Her maid was a young woman named Wren Cobley, 22 years old with freckles and a remarkably direct way of looking at things that had made Isolde trust her from the start. Wren helped her dress each morning and undress each night, and she had been with Isolde for 3 years, since before the marriage. She knew, without being told, when her mistress was genuinely unwell, and when something else was wrong. On a rainy Wednesday in April, while Isolde was resting on the chaise in her dressing room, and Wren was tidying the dressing table, the maid picked up the bottle of tonic and held it to the light from the window. She turned it in her fingers, reading the label. Then she uncorked it and sniffed the contents. Her expression did not change dramatically, Wren's face rarely did, but something shifted behind her eyes. She set the bottle down with particular care, as if she were thinking very hard about where to place it. That evening, while Isolde was at supper, Wren took the tonic to the village chemist, a retired man named Aldous Percy, who had spent 40 years compounding medicines and recognized an unfamiliar substance in a preparation in under 2 minutes. Wren came to Isolde the following morning with her face carefully composed and her hands clasped in front of her, and told her employer, in a low and steady voice, what Aldous Percy had found. The tonic contained, in addition to the listed ingredients, a compound derived from henbane, a plant with well-documented properties for inducing confusion, trembling, and, in sustained doses, what a physician observing from the outside might readily diagnose as the symptoms of hysteria or nervous collapse. Wren spoke clearly and without exaggeration. She then said that she believed the Duchess should write to her uncle immediately, and that the tonic should not be taken again. Isolde sat very still while Wren spoke. She had the sensation of the floor shifting beneath her chair. Not literally, not the dizziness. This was something else entirely. The feeling of a world reorganizing itself around a fact she was not ready for. She thought of the way Alaric had produced the bottle from his pocket, the efficiency of the gesture, as if it had been prepared, as if it had been planned. She said to Wren, "You must not tell anyone about this." She was thinking of what would happen to Wren if she did. She did not think quickly enough. Within 36 hours of that conversation, Wren Cobley was gone from Ashenvale Hall. No notice, no farewell, no letter left behind. Isolde came down to breakfast on a Thursday morning and was told by Mrs. Ballow, with a very careful expression, that Wren had received word of a family emergency and had departed the previous night. When Isolde asked to see the note Wren had allegedly left, Mrs. Ballow said there had been no note, that the girl had simply gone. When Isolde pressed further, asking where Wren's family lived so she might write to check on her, Mrs. Ballow looked briefly and unhappily to the right, the direction of the Duke's study, and said she did not know. Isolde sat with her untouched breakfast and understood. She had underestimated him. She had not understood that a man who would poison his wife's morning tonic would have also thought 3 moves ahead. She had shown her hand too early. She had told Wren not to say anything, but she had not considered that Wren might be watched. She had not considered that this was not the beginning of something she could stop. It was already well underway. And she was alone in the house, with a man who had just proven, beyond any question, what he was capable of. She stopped taking the tonic. Quietly, without announcement, she poured each morning's dose out the window of her dressing room, watching it darken the stones of the garden wall below. Without it, she could feel her mind attempting to reassemble itself, as though pieces that had been deliberately scattered were slowly finding their way back to their proper positions. The clarity, when it came, was both a relief and a horror. Because with clarity came memory of small things she had registered but not processed in the blurred weeks prior. The estate manager Grafton speaking in a low voice with someone outside the study door. A letter on the hallway table addressed to a firm of solicitors in Edinburgh, sealed before she could read the recipient's name. Alaric watching her at dinner with an expression she had attributed to concern and now understood as something else entirely. Assessment. He was watching to see how far along the process was. She considered her options. She could leave, but she had no money of her own, not since their marriage had placed her inheritance under his authority. She could write to Cormac, but she had already done so once and received a reply suggesting Alaric had somehow intercepted it. She did not have long. She understood this in a way that settled into her chest, not as panic, but as precision, the way extreme cold sometimes produces extreme clarity. She had, at most, a matter of weeks before Alaric realized the tonic was not working as intended. She needed to think. She needed to plan. She was sitting at her dressing table at 10:30 on a Monday night, composing a letter to Cormac using language so oblique that she hoped Alaric would not understand it, even if he did intercept it, when she heard the sound of a motor car on the drive below. 2 sets of footsteps in the entrance hall. Dr. Prewitt's voice and then Alaric's, too low to make out the words. A long pause, then footsteps on the stairs. Not Alaric's familiar measured tread, but the clinical, unhurried pace of a man who had come to do something specific. She sealed the letter. She tucked it inside the bodice of her dressing gown. She stood. She composed her face into the confused, helpless expression she had watched herself lose, and now understood she needed to perform. The door opened, and what came next was the thing that would haunt her for 2 years, and then make her dangerous. Harrowfield Sanatorium stood on the edge of a moor in the West Riding of Yorkshire, a place where the wind never fully stopped and the sky stayed the same flat gray from November through March. The building itself was Victorian in the worst sense, all iron-fenced perimeter, tall, narrow windows, designed to admit light while preventing escape. Red brick blackened by decades of industrial soot from the mill town 4 miles south. It had been established in 1887 as a private institution for the treatment of nervous disorders in women of the upper classes, which was to say a respectable place to send women whose inconvenience required a legitimate explanation. Its reputation was careful and its records were discreet, and it accepted new patients upon appropriate documentation from qualified physicians and male family members who could attest to the patient's condition. The documentation for Isolde's admission had been signed by Dr. Prewitt and countersigned by her husband. It described a woman in the advanced stages of hysterical collapse, prone to delusions, potentially dangerous to herself. The admitting warden had looked at it, and then at the pale, exhausted woman in the carriage, and had seen no reason to question it. He had seen it many times before. She woke on her first morning at Harrowfield, not knowing how long she had been there. The room was small. A bed, a washstand, a window with a bar across it that divided the moor view into a grid of gray squares. The sheet beneath her was coarse cotton. Her clothes were gone, replaced with a standard institution dress, a shapeless thing in faded blue. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and spent several minutes simply verifying that she was still herself. She could remember her name. She could remember Ashenvale Hall, the blue vase, the Norfolk painting. She could remember Wren and the bottle of tonic and the sound of footsteps on the stairs. The memories were blurred at the edges, like photographs left in sunlight, but they were there. She was there. She had not become what the document said she was. She held onto that with both hands, the way a person holds onto a rope in moving water. The door of her room had a small window at face height, and through it she could hear the sounds of the institution beginning its morning routine. Footsteps on linoleum, the clank of a medicine trolley, a distant voice giving instructions in a tone designed for those assumed to understand nothing. The weeks at Harrowfield blurred in the way that all places do when there is no variation to mark time's passage. There was breakfast, there was the medication. The orderly brought in a small paper cup each morning. There were 2 periods of supervised walking in the courtyard, during which patients moved in slow circles like water draining. There were sessions with the on-site physician who asked her questions from a list and wrote her answers in a notebook he never let her see. Isolde answered his questions carefully, honestly, mostly, but with the awareness that honesty about the tonic, about Alaric, about the accounts, would be absorbed into the diagnostic framework of her file and emerge as further evidence of delusion. She did not take the morning medication, or rather, she appeared to take it, holding the small paper cup to her lips and pressing the tablet beneath her tongue and disposing of it later in the courtyard drain. It was dangerous, but being medicated was more dangerous. She could feel herself thinking more clearly with each day she refused it. She built small routines, observations she recorded in her memory because she had no paper, patterns she tracked in the staff's behavior, weaknesses in the daily routine. She filed away carefully against the day she would need them. Dr. Alara Finch arrived at Harrowfield on a Tuesday in October, 7 months after Isolde's admission. She came as a replacement for the previous physician, who had retired abruptly, and she was 35 years old, compact and precise in her movements, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of eyes that looked at things from multiple angles before settling on a conclusion. She had qualified at Edinburgh and spent 5 years in the women's ward at the Royal Infirmary before accepting the Harrowfield post, and she brought with her a diagnostic approach that was, for its time and place, unusual. She began by disbelieving the file, not dismissing it. She read every document carefully, but treating it as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a conclusion to be confirmed. She reviewed Isolde's case on her first day. She noted the original diagnosis. She noted the patient's history as recorded by Dr. Prewitt. She noted the treatment protocol. She noted the date of admission. Then she requested an unmedicated observation period, citing her preference for baseline assessment before continuing treatment. The request was unusual. The warden granted it reluctantly. Alara sat down across from Isolde in the small consulting room, and for the first time in 7 months, someone looked at Isolde Vane as though she might be worth listening to. They talked for 2 hours on that first Tuesday. Alara asked about Isolde's history, not the hysterical episodes, not the delusions, but her life before Harrowfield, her childhood in Norfolk, her Uncle Cormac, the small school on the estate, the marriage. Isolde answered carefully at first, watching Alara's face for the particular blankness of a physician who had already made up her mind. She did not find it. What she found instead was attention, the kind that asks follow-up questions that only make sense if the answers to the first questions actually mattered. When Isolde mentioned the accounts, Ilara's pen stilled on her notepad. When Isolde described the tonic, the trembling hands, the replaced maid, Ilara's expression did not change, but she stopped writing entirely, which Isolde has already identified as the sign of a person storing something separately from the official record. At the end of the 2 hours, Ilara said, "I would like to continue this conversation tomorrow, if you are willing." It was the first time anyone at Harrowfield had asked for her willingness. Isolde said yes. She walked back to her room that evening with something she had not felt in 7 months pressing carefully against the inside of her sternum: hope. Over the following 6 weeks, Ilara reduced Isolde's sedative dosage by increments so gradual they did not appear in the official treatment log as anything other than routine adjustment. She cross-referenced Isolde's described symptoms against the known chemical properties of henbane compounds, using a pharmacology reference she had ordered from Edinburgh. And she compiled her findings in a personal notebook she kept locked in the case she brought to work each morning and took home each night. She did not share her conclusions with the warden. She understood that sharing them would trigger a review that would, in all probability, result in her removal from Harrowfield and a revised treatment protocol for the patient. She had seen it happen before. Instead, she brought Isolde paper, a small notebook, the kind that could be pressed flat under a mattress, and a pencil that could be similarly concealed. Isolde looked at these objects for a long moment before picking them up. "What do you want me to do with these?" she asked. Ilara looked at her steadily. "Remember everything," she said. "Write it all down: dates, names, amounts, everything you know about those accounts." Isolde picked up the pencil. Her hand was steady. It had not been steady in 7 months. The notebook filled slowly and precisely over the following 3 months. Isolde wrote in the early mornings before the staff changed shifts, pressing the pages flat and sliding the book beneath the mattress before the door opened. She wrote from memory, and her memory, stripped of the tonic, given clean air and the growing certainty that someone believed her, proved better than she had dared hope. She could recall figures, dates, the names of the firms that had appeared in Alaric's correspondence. She could recall the specific wording of entries in the estate ledger that had first made her uneasy. She built in the 50 pages of that notebook a picture that was not complete. She did not have the documents, could not yet prove what she suspected, but was detailed enough to form the skeleton of something that, with the right person in the right place, with access to the actual records, could become proof. Ilara read each new entry without comment, her face professionally composed. But on the morning Isolde showed her the final page, the estimated total of the funds she believed Alaric had diverted over 3 years. Ilara set the notebook down and pressed her fingers briefly against her mouth. Then she said simply, quietly, with absolute certainty, "I'm going to write to your uncle." Cormac Hartwell was 63 years old, white-haired, and built like a man who had spent his life outdoors managing a Norfolk estate. Broad through the shoulders, deliberate in his movements, with a face that showed everything it felt, whether he wished it to or not. He had loved Isolde since she was 8 years old, and had come to live with him after her parents died, carrying a small leather bag and a composure that had broken his heart precisely because she was too young to know it was already extraordinary. He had walked her down the aisle at Ashenvale Hall with the private concern of a man who did not fully trust the groom, but had no evidence sufficient to say so aloud. He had received her first letter, the oblique, careful one she had written before the footsteps on the stairs, and had read it 4 times and understood from its evasiveness that something was deeply wrong. He had then received nothing for 7 months. Not a word. He had written 6 letters to Ashenvale Hall and received formal 3-line replies, purportedly written in Isolde's hand that did not sound like Isolde's voice in any sentence. He had been trying to find her. Then Alara Finch's letter arrived on a Friday morning, and he was in his motor car within the hour. He came to Harrowfield not as a social visitor, but as a former solicitor. From 40 years ago, before the estate had consumed all his professional attention, who had obtained, through contacts in London he had never stopped maintaining, a formal writ of review from a magistrate questioning the legality of the original committal order. It was not a release order, not yet, but it was enough to require the warden to allow independent examination of the patient. Ilara met him at the gate on a Tuesday morning in January, 14 months after Isolde's admission. She had the medical notebook under her arm. She brought him to the consulting room and then went to fetch Isolde. Isolde walked in and stopped when she saw him. Cormac rose from his chair. His face did the thing it always did, showed everything. And what it showed in that moment was a grief so large and a relief so absolute that it occupied the entire room. He crossed to her. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her, the way a man looks at something he thought he had lost irretrievably and cannot yet trust that he is truly seeing. "Isolde," he said. That was all. It was enough. The plan that the 3 of them constructed over the following 3 weeks was careful, specific, and deliberately unhurried. Rushing was not an option. Alaric Vane had connections in the legal system. A solicitor in London named Bramwell, who had handled the committal documentation, a magistrate in the West Riding, who was a shooting companion, and whose name appeared in Alaric's correspondence. And any attempt to pursue formal release through standard channels risked triggering a response that would result in Isolde being moved to a facility where she would be harder to reach. What they needed was not a rescue. What they needed was evidence, enough of it organized well enough, to ensure that when Isolde left Harrowfield, she did not leave as a patient who had recovered sufficiently for release, but as a woman who had never legitimately been a patient at all. "If we go too soon," Ilara said, on the 3rd evening, with the fire burning low and 3 cups of cooling tea on the consulting room table, "he will simply find another doctor and another facility and another set of documents, and the next time will be designed to prevent exactly this kind of interference." Cormac nodded. He had already thought this. Isolde, listening, said, "I need the estate ledgers." The escape itself happened on a night in February, 14 months and 3 days after Isolde had arrived at Harrowfield. It was not dramatic in the way that escapes are in stories. No climbing of walls, no pursuing figures, no overturned furniture. It was quiet and deliberate, and had been planned across 6 weeks of small adjustments. Ilara had arranged her schedule so that she was on duty on that particular night. She had arranged, through careful management of the staff rota, that the 2 staff members on overnight duty on the East Corridor were both people who were occupied elsewhere. She had procured a set of clothing for Isolde, sensible dark wool, a traveling coat, which she had brought into the facility folded inside her own case over several visits. At 2:30 in the morning, she unlocked the door of Isolde's room. Isolde was already dressed. She was standing in the center of the room with a small notebook pressed flat inside the lining of the coat, and she was looking at the window, the barred window with its grid of gray squares, for the last time. She did not say goodbye to it. She turned, walked through the door, and did not look back. Cormac was waiting on the moor road 300 yards from the perimeter fence, the motorcar's engine running, its lights dark. Isolde walked to it across the frost-stiff grass with Alara beside her, moving in silence through a night so cold that every breath made a small white cloud that dissolved before it could become a trail. The moor around them was absolute dark. The sky above it, absolute dark. No moon, no stars visible through the cloud cover. Only the distant orange smear on the horizon that was the mill town 4 miles away. She had been inside for over a year. She had forgotten the way open air felt against a face, the way cold, clean, and unobstructed moved differently from the recycled warmth of institutional corridors. She stopped for a moment, involuntarily, just on the far side of the fence where the moor grass began. She tilted her face upward into the dark and simply breathed it in. Alara touched her arm, gently. They did not have long. Isolde lowered her face. She walked to the motor car. Cormac opened the door and she got in, and the door closed behind her with a quiet, solid click. The motor car moved. The lights stayed off until they reached the road. They drove south, then east, away from everything. They drove for 6 hours through the night, stopping once for petrol at a station on the outskirts of Leeds, where the attendant was too tired to look up. By the time the sky began to shift from black to the particular ink blue that comes before dawn, they were into the flatlands of Lincolnshire, crossing the fens on a road that ran straight between dark water channels on either side. Isolde sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and watched the landscape move past the window. Alara sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for the first 2 hours. Cormac drove. Finally, somewhere past midnight, with the heater making the only sound in the motor car, Alara said quietly, "You should try to sleep." Isolde looked at her. "I'm afraid that if I close my eyes," she said carefully, "I will open them and be in that room again." Alara considered this honestly. "I understand," she said, "but your body needs rest to heal, and you are going to need to be very well indeed for what comes next." Isolde looked out the window again. The fenlands stretched flat and patient in every direction. "Yes," she said finally, and closed her eyes. She slept. She did not dream of the room. The cottage was on the Moray coast in Scotland, a low stone building 40 yards from the sea that Cormac had rented under a name connected to neither of them in any traceable way. He had stocked it beforehand. Coal for the fire, food in the larder, blankets that smelled of cedar storage, a small sitting room with a table large enough to work at, a bedroom with curtains that blocked the morning light, a view from the sitting room window of the North Sea, gray-green in winter, restless, enormous, going on forever in all directions until it blurred into the horizon and became indistinguishable from the sky. Isolde stood at that window on her first morning in the cottage and pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and looked at the water. Alara was behind her, making tea. Cormac was at the table, reviewing the notes they had brought. In a little while, they would sit down together and begin working out what they knew, what they could prove, and what they still needed. In a little while. But for this moment, just this single early morning moment, Isolde stood at the window and breathed. In, out again. She was alive, she was free, and she had a great deal of work to do. 2 years is a long time when you are waiting. It is a short time when you are building something that must not fail. Isolde understood this, and she divided those 2 years accordingly, not into days or weeks, because days and weeks would make the waiting unbearable, but into tasks. Each task had a completion condition. Each completion condition unlocked the next task. It was the most disciplined thing she had ever done in her life, and she did it in a stone cottage on the Moray coast with the North Sea as her only witness. And she did not let herself think about the warm rooms of Ashenvale Hall or the blue vase on the mantelpiece, or the way the autumn light came through the south windows in the afternoon, amber and slow and kind, because thinking about those things was not a task. It was a wound, and she could not afford to be wounded. Not yet. First, the estate accounts. She had the notebook. She had the figures. She needed access to the actual documents. This was the problem she gave to Cormac's London solicitor, a careful, methodical man named Tobias Crane, 50 years old, with offices in Gray's Inn and a reputation for patience that Isolde found immediately and profoundly reassuring. Tobias Crane had spent the first month reviewing what Isolde had reconstructed from memory, the figures, the dates, the names of the transfer accounts, and had concluded, without theatrics, that what she described was consistent with a systematic embezzlement operation that had been running for at least 4 years prior to her committal. He wrote to her in the careful, coded language they had established, references to estate management matters that, to anyone who might intercept the letter, were unremarkably tedious. To Isolde, they were a map. He had, through contacts he declined to name specifically, obtained access to the records of the private Edinburgh account under the name Ralston and Associates, a name she had caught in Alaric's correspondence and recorded in the notebook. He had cross-referenced it against a second account registered under a different name in a Dublin bank. He had found a third. The total figure he eventually arrived at, expressed in the letter as a reference to square acreage of hypothetical farmland, represented a sum that, converted at the appropriate rate, meant that Duke Alaric Vane had diverted, over the course of 6 years, enough money to rebuild every tenant cottage on the Ashenvale estate twice over, and still have enough remaining to retire comfortably to the continent. The death certificate was the thing that had briefly stopped Tobias's habitual composure. It had been filed with the General Register Office in London 18 months after Isolde's committal, which meant that for the past 6 months, she had been, on paper, legally dead. Alaric had filed it himself, citing a private physician's attestation, the physician being Dr. Prewitt, whose signature had also appeared on the original committal order. The certificate listed the date of death as 6 weeks after Isolde's admission to Harrowfield, a date by which, presumably, Alaric had expected the sedative regimen to have achieved a conclusion he had not been required to manage directly. When it had not, the death certificate had been filed anyway. Either he was supremely confident the matter would resolve itself in his favor, or he had decided that the paperwork would precede the reality. Isolde read Tobias's coded description of this document 3 times in the sitting room of the Moray cottage while the fire burned and the sea moved outside the window. She pressed her thumbnail into the palm of her other hand until the sensation was sharp enough to anchor her. She was not dead. She had proof she was not dead. What she needed now was for the world to see it. Ilara's contribution to the evidence was both the most personal and the most formally powerful. Over the 2 years in the cottage, she had compiled from memory and from the personal medical notebook she had kept at Harrow Field a full clinical account of Isolde's case. The original diagnosis as presented in Dr. Prewitt's documentation, the discrepancies she had identified between that documentation and the observable clinical presentation, the chemical profile of henbane compounds and their symptomatic overlap with the conditions Prewitt had listed, and her own detailed record of Isolde's presentation under reduced sedation, the speed and clarity of her cognitive recovery, the absence of any symptom consistent with the hysterical condition the documents described. She had had this account reviewed by a colleague at Edinburgh, a senior physician who had no connection to Alaric, to Harrowfield, or to any element of the case. And he had provided a written assessment confirming that the documentation as described did not support the original diagnosis, and that the treatment protocol, including the nature of the tonic, constituted a serious and deliberate harm to the patient. He signed it with his full name and credentials. It was the most important piece of paper in the case. They kept it in a locked tin in the cottage fireplace alcove, and Isolde checked on it every morning. The witness they had not expected was Wren Cobley, found in the spring of the second year by one of Cormac's Norfolk contacts, who had, on Cormac's quiet instruction, been keeping an eye on the movements of former Ashenvale Hall staff. Wren was living in Ipswich, working as a seamstress, and when Cormac's contact approached her with extreme caution and asked whether she might be willing to speak to someone about her time at the hall, she had not hesitated. She had said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask." She came to London in May, not to the cottage. Isolde's location remained known only to Cormac, Ilara, and Tobias, but to Tobias's Gray's Inn offices, where she gave a signed statement that described in precise, unflinching detail the day she had taken the tonic bottle to the village chemist, what Aldous Percy had told her, and what had happened to her in the 36 hours that followed. She named Grafton. She named the specific morning she had last seen the Duke speak privately with Dr. Prewitt, before Prewitt's second visit to the hall. She remembered everything. She had always remembered everything. She had simply not had anywhere to put it yet. Tobias brought everything together in the autumn: the financial records, the death certificate, Ilara's clinical account, and the Edinburgh Physician's Review, Wren's signed statement, and the original committal documentation, and assembled from these materials a formal submission to the Lord Chancellor's office and a parallel submission to Scotland Yard's Fraud Investigation Unit. He did not use Isolde's name in the initial submissions. He used the name of the estate, the names of the financial institutions, and the name of Ralston and Associates, and he let the documents lead. The fraud investigation opened in October. The investigator assigned, an inspector named Holloway, blunt and thorough, spent 3 weeks reviewing the financial materials, and then asked, with a particular tone of a man who has found the center of something, whether there was a person connected to the estate who could provide direct testimony. Tobias said yes. He said that person would require certain guarantees before presenting themselves publicly, given the existence of a false death certificate in their name. Holloway had looked at the document for a long time. "She is alive?" he asked. Tobias had said, "Very much so." Holloway had said simply, "Good." He had meant it. He had closed the fraud file and opened a second, significantly more serious one. It was Isolde who decided on the ball. Tobias had suggested a formal presentation to the magistrate. Quiet, legal, controlled. Cormac had preferred this approach. Alara had said nothing, understanding that this was not her decision. But Isolde had sat with the plan for 3 days and then said no. Not because she wanted spectacle. She did not want spectacle. She wanted something that could not be quietly managed. She knew Alaric. She had spent 7 years watching him move through rooms, manage situations, and contain narratives before they could spread beyond his control. And she knew that a magistrate's court, however formal, was still a room. And Alaric had never entered a room he could not work. The royal midsummer ball at Caldermore Palace was a different proposition. It was 400 guests, 6 members of the nobility, 2 government ministers, and, Tobias had confirmed, several representatives of the London press. It was a room too large for one man to control, and Alaric would be there, because Alaric was always at the Caldermore ball. And this year, he planned to announce his engagement, which meant he would be more visible, more exposed, and less able to retreat without the entire assembled world noticing him go. She told Tobias to get her an invitation. He got her 3. London in July was a different animal from the Mire coast. Isolde had not been here in 2 years, and the city came at her all at once as Cormac's motor car made its way through Bloomsbury toward the hotel they had booked under the name Alara had used for the reservation. Mrs. Finch and party, 2 rooms, 3 nights. The streets were warm in the way that London in summer was always warm, not cleanly but densely, layered with bus exhaust and flower cellars and the hot breath of pavement that had been in sun since morning. Through the motor car window, she watched the city living its ordinary, oblivious life. A woman with a hat box, 2 boys running after a dog, an old man asleep in a chair outside a pub. And she felt the strangeness of it, that all of this had continued, that the city had not paused, that the world had simply gone on while she was on the moor in a room with a barred window. She pressed her hand against the motorcar door. She was here. She was present. Tomorrow was the ball, but first, this evening, Tobias, the evidence. One final review, seated around the table in his office in Gray's Inn, making sure there was nothing that had been missed and nothing that could be taken back. Tobias Crane's office smelled of paper and old leather and the particular dusty warmth of rooms that have housed important conversations for a very long time. He laid everything on the conference table in the order it would be presented. The financial records first, the clearest and most immediately damaging, followed by the death certificate, which sat in its own folder with a particular kind of silence around it. Then, Ilara's clinical account tabbed and cross-referenced. Then the Edinburgh Physician's Review. Then Wren's statement, handwritten in her careful seamstress's script, 3 pages long. Tobias walked through each item without theatrics, explaining what it proved, what it suggested, and what a competent defense attorney might attempt to say about it. For each attempted argument, he had a counter prepared. He had been preparing for this for 8 months. He was calm in the way of a man who has done everything within his power and has made peace with what is beyond it. Isolde sat at the end of the table and listened to him. Across the table, Inspector Holloway sat with his own set of copies, making occasional notes. Cormac sat beside Isolde. Ilara was at the window. The city made its sounds outside. When Tobias finished, there was a silence. Then Holloway said, "It's enough." Inspector Holloway had spent 2 months reviewing the financial submissions, and he was a man unaccustomed to being surprised. He had spent 15 years in Scotland Yard's fraud division and had developed in that time a comprehensive immunity to shock at what people would do for money. But the death certificate had done something to his expression that the financial records had not. He had gone very still when Tobias first showed it to him. And now, in the Gray's Inn office, he returned to it one final time, holding it at the corner between 2 fingers, as if the paper itself were something he did not want to touch unnecessarily. "He had her committed," he said, not asking. "He poisoned her to produce the symptoms that justify the committal," Tobias replied. He arranged for the committal documentation to be signed by his personal physician. He dismissed the maid who discovered the tonic. He diverted intercepted correspondence so that her family could not locate her. And when the intended resolution did not occur on the timeline he expected, he filed a death certificate rather than wait for one to become legitimate. Holloway set the document down. He looked at Isolde across the table. "You are a very brave woman," he said quietly. "I'm a very angry one," she replied. Cormac had arranged the remaining logistics with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 60 years solving problems. He had confirmed with the palace secretariat that the ball would proceed as planned, that the Duke of Ashenvale was among the confirmed guests, and that an inspector of Scotland Yard could be present among the event's security staff without announcement or explanation, not an unusual arrangement for events of that scale. He had also arranged for Tobias to attend as a guest, for Ilara to attend as the companion of a friend who had a standing invitation, and for Wren Cobley to wait in a hotel 2 streets from Caldermore Palace, available by telephone if she was needed. He had confirmed the presence of 3 members of the press who had been given, through a carefully managed intermediary, advance indication that the ball might yield something newsworthy without any specifics that could be traced back to their party. He had covered every angle he could think of, and several that Tobias had identified. He sat across from Isolde in Tobias's office as Tobias rolled the documents back into their folders and said, simply and sincerely, "We have done everything we can." Isolde looked at the table where the evidence had been, now cleared, except for the grain of the wood and the ring from Cormac's teacup. She thought about everything that had happened to build those documents. The months in the room with the barred window, the mornings hiding the notebook under the mattress, the night walk across the frost-stiff moor, the 2 years in the cottage with the sea outside, the task-by-task patience of it all. She thought about Wren, who had known something was wrong and had acted on that knowledge and had lost her position for it, and had waited quietly in Ipswich for 2 years for someone to come and ask. She thought about Ilara, who had walked into a sanatorium as a new physician and had chosen, at professional risk she could not fully calculate, to believe a patient the record said was not worth believing. She thought about Cormac, who had driven 6 hours through the night with his lights off and had not cried until the motorcar stopped on the moor road, and he could afford to. She felt, very suddenly and without warning, the full weight of what it had taken to survive. She let herself feel it for exactly one breath. Then she set it down. She had one more thing to do before the morning. She went back to the hotel alone. Cormac walked with her, but waited in the lobby, which was exactly what she needed. And she sat at the small writing desk in her room and wrote a letter addressed to Cormac, to be opened in the event that something went wrong at the ball. She was not certain what going wrong would look like exactly. Alaric was not a man who made his moves openly, but he was unpredictable under pressure, and she had been wrong about him before. She wrote the letter plainly, without drama. She described everything: the accounts, the tonic, the committal, the death certificate. She named everyone. She described where the evidence was held. She told Cormac, in the final paragraph, that she was proud of what they had done and that she was not afraid. She sealed the letter. She pressed it with her palm for a moment. Then she put it inside the small leather bag she had brought from the cottage, which also contained a spare set of documents Tobias had duplicated. And she set the bag on the chair beside the bed where she could see it. She lay down. She did not sleep immediately, but she slept eventually, deeply, without dreams. The gown had been Ilara's idea, not the style. Isolde had known what she wanted to wear from the moment she decided on the ball. But the color. Ilara had said silver specifically, and when Isolde asked why, Ilara had said, "Because you are not in mourning, and because they will see you before they hear you, and what they see should not be forgettable." Isolde had agreed. The dressmaker had produced something that was, Isolde thought on the morning she put it on for the first time, exactly right. Not elaborate. She was not a woman who used elaboration as armor. Simple and severe, in line, with a depth of color that moved between silver and gray depending on the light, like water under cloud. She stood before the hotel room's full-length mirror and looked at herself for a long time. She was 31 years old. She looked older than she had 7 years ago, and younger than she had felt in Harrowfield. And she looked above all like herself, the self she had been rebuilding for 2 years in a cottage on the sea. Not the frightened wife who had watched her notes curl and blacken in the library fireplace. Not the patient in the faded blue institution dress. This, herself. She put on her earrings. She was ready. Alaric Vane moved toward the terrace doors with the measured urgency of a man who has decided to appear unhurried while also leaving. It was a particular skill, one he had developed over decades of managing situations that required visible composure and invisible retreat. And it had served him well many times. He knew exactly how to move through a room without triggering the attention of the people in it. A slight angle of the shoulder, a direction that could, from any vantage point, be read as intentional rather than evasive. A face that communicated mild social purpose rather than fear. He was deploying all of this now. He had crossed 8 feet of marble floor since he had seen Isolde's face. He had 4 feet remaining before he reached the terrace doors. The crowd between him and those doors was thinning slightly. People had stepped back, unconsciously creating a clear space in the room. The kind of space that forms when everyone has stopped moving and is watching something. He registered this peripherally. He pressed on. 3 feet. Then he reached the terrace doors, pushed the handle down with his right hand, and opened them, and found Lord Cormac Hartwell standing in the doorway, accompanied by 2 very calm, very large men who were plainly not guests. Cormac had the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the moment of it. He looked at his niece's husband, the man who had poisoned her, committed her, filed a death certificate in her name, and then planned to announce his engagement to another woman at the royal midsummer ball. And he said absolutely nothing. He did not need to. The two men flanking him were Inspector Holloway and a constable from Scotland Yard, who had been stationed in the garden since 9 o'clock that evening. Holloway showed his identification with the quiet efficiency of a man for whom this was not extraordinary, merely procedural. He said in a voice low enough for the three of them and no one else that the Duke of Ashenvale was requested not to leave the premises this evening and that he would be grateful for the Duke's cooperation. Alaric looked at Holloway. He looked at the identification. He looked at Cormac's expression, which had not changed. He looked, briefly, back into the ballroom, at the 800 candles, at the guests who had stopped moving, at Isolde, who was 20 feet away and watching him. Then he turned back inside. He had nowhere else to go. The room, which had been silent, was now very still in a different way. The stillness of 800 people simultaneously holding their breath, waiting to understand what they were seeing. Alaric walked back through the terrace doors onto the ballroom floor, and the crowd parted around him without quite meaning to. He was still carrying himself with some attempt at composure, old instinct, too deep to fully suppress. But the color had not returned to his face, and the set of his jaw was wrong, too tight, betraying the effort it was costing him. Lady Seraphine Colt had not moved from where he had left her. She was standing near the center of the room with her ivory satin and her pearls, and her face was now a collection of very careful, very controlled expressions layered over something that was beginning, at the edges, to look like panic. She looked at Alaric as he walked back in, and what she found in his face made her take one involuntary step backward. Alaric stopped in the middle of the room. He was now equidistant from both the terrace doors and the main doors. He turned, and Isolde was in front of him, 6 feet away, the same distance she had stopped at before. She had not moved. She had waited. Isolde. Her name came out of him in a voice she had never heard him use. Not the controlled voice, not the managing voice. Something stripped of its layers. Involuntary, almost a question. She did not answer. Not immediately. She let the name sit in the air between them. Let the entire room hear it. Let everyone who had attended the memorial service and signed the condolence book hear the voice of a man addressing, by name, the woman he had declared dead. Then she said, simply and clearly, and with a precision she had been practicing for 2 years, "Good evening, Alaric." 3 words. She watched them land. She watched him calculate. She had always been able to see him calculating. She understood that now she had mistaken it for thoughtfulness and care, but it was always calculation. And she watched the calculations fail one by one as his mind moved through the options and found each of them blocked. The crowd was too large. The press was present. Cormac was at the terrace doors. Tobias Crane was moving through the guests toward them with a briefcase in his hand, his expression the serene composure of a man who has done his preparation and trusts the work. There was nothing left to calculate. Isolde did not shout. She did not need to. The room was already quiet, and she had, in the 2 years on the Moray coast and in the weeks of preparation in London, arrived at the particular state of calm that comes when a person has stopped being afraid of a thing and is simply dealing with it. She turned slightly from Alaric, not dismissing him, not done with him, but including the room. And she spoke in the voice of a woman addressing a gathering of her equals, which was exactly what she was. "My name is Isolde Vane, Duchess of Ashenvale," she said. "Many of you attended a memorial service held in my name 18 months ago. I was not, as the documentation filed by my husband stated, deceased. I was a patient at Harrowfield Sanatorium in Yorkshire, placed there under a fraudulent committal order on the basis of a diagnosis manufactured by my husband's personal physician to conceal my discovery of systematic fraud within the Ashenvale estate accounts. I have been absent from this room for 2 years. I have spent those 2 years assembling the evidence necessary to return to it. I have assembled it." She paused. She looked directly at Alaric. "All of it." The effect of these words moved through the gathered guests, like the recognition of her face had moved through them at the beginning of the evening, in expanding rings from the center outward, each ring a slightly different grade of comprehension. Nearest to her, close enough to hear every word, the reactions were immediate and visible. A dowager's hand going to her mouth, 2 ministers exchanging a look that contained, in the compressed language of long acquaintance, an entire conversation about what this meant. Farther out, people were still working out what had been said, and farthest out, nearest the walls, the word was spreading, still murmured from person to person with increasing speed. What remained constant throughout was the silence, not the silence of empty rooms, but the heavier silence of a very full room in which no one wants to be the one to make an unnecessary sound. Tobias Crane reached Isolde's side and opened the briefcase. He removed the uppermost folder and held it out. Not to Isolde, not to Alaric, but to Inspector Holloway, who had come in from the terrace doors and was crossing the floor toward them with the steady, purposeful stride of a man arriving at the most important moment of a very long investigation. Seraphine Colt left the ballroom sometime between the opening of the briefcase and Inspector Holloway's first formal question to the Duke. No one saw her go. The room's attention was arranged elsewhere, and she did not take anything with her except her ivory evening bag and whatever dignity could be carried quickly and in silence. She walked through the east corridor and out through the servants' entrance and into the warm London night. And she did not stop walking for a very long time. This was something Isolde learned afterward, and she felt about it nothing in particular. Seraphine Colt was not the enemy. She was simply a woman who had been told a story that had turned out not to be true, and she had left when the truth arrived, which was perhaps the most sensible decision anyone made at Caldermore Palace that evening. The rest of the evening, the formal production of the evidence, the moment when 2 constables came through the main doors and approached the Duke at the inspector's signal. All of this Isolde witnessed with the same precise external calm she had used to walk into the room. Inside, it was different. Inside, something that had been held rigid for 2 years and 3 months was beginning, with enormous caution, to release. The formal production of the evidence took 45 minutes, not because the documents themselves required extensive explanation, but because Alaric's solicitor, Bramwell, who had arrived at the ball as a guest and was now attempting with diminishing success to insert himself into the proceedings, kept interrupting. He was a small man with a very loud manner, and he deployed both aggressively citing procedural irregularities, questioning the provenance of the financial documents, suggesting that the patient at Harrowfield could not be authenticated as the Duchess without additional documentation. Tobias Crane answered each interruption with the calm of a man who had anticipated every single one of them. When Bramwell cited procedural irregularity, Tobias produced the writ of magistrate review that Cormac had obtained 18 months earlier, predating any procedural question Bramwell could raise. When he questioned the financial documents, Tobias produced signed authentication from the bank's own inspector. When he suggested authentication of Isolde's identity, Tobias produced a sworn affidavit from the registrar at the church where Isolde and Alaric had married, accompanied by the wedding register itself, couriered from Hampshire that morning. With each production, Bramwell became quieter. After the 12th, he became silent. The room watched all of this from the radius of space that had formed around Isolde and the inspector, like a theater audience that has forgotten it is watching a performance. The death certificate was the moment the room changed again. Holloway held it up, briefly, precisely, for long enough to be seen by those closest, and read aloud from it in his flat, factual Scotland Yard voice. The patient's name, the stated date of death, the cause, the attending physician. He read the physician's name, Dr. Pruitt, with no additional inflection, and then he asked the room whether Dr. Pruitt was present. He was not. He had not been at the ball. He had, Holloway noted, also not been at his registered London address since the previous Friday, which was something his colleagues were looking into. He set the certificate down. He looked at Alaric. "Your Grace," he said, with the particular formal courtesy of a policeman who is about to say something very serious, "I am obliged to ask whether you can account for this document." Alaric said nothing. His solicitor had told him to say nothing, and for once in his life, Alaric was listening to someone else's advice, his silence, in that room, at that moment, in front of every face that had attended the memorial service and believed the story he had built, and cried over the woman who was standing 6 feet away from him, very much alive. His silence was its own answer. Everyone in the room heard it. The financial records occupied the next 20 minutes and required Tobias to be joined at the briefcase by a specialist from the fraud investigation unit, who walked through the transfer records with the systematic precision of someone who had been reviewing them for 8 weeks and had moved far beyond their surface into their structure. He named the accounts. He named the institutions. He named the total figure diverted, not the estimate from Tobias's initial review, but the verified total arrived at after 8 weeks of cross-referencing with the actual banking records obtained under the magistrate's warrant. It was a number that produced, when he read it aloud, a sound in the room, not a collective gasp, but a collective exhale, the sound of 800 people simultaneously releasing a breath they had not known they were holding. Grafton, the estate manager, was named. The Edinburgh solicitor who had administered the accounts was named. Several of the transactions, the specialist noted, had been countersigned. The countersignature was a convincing reproduction of the Duchess of Ashenvale's hand, used to authorize withdrawals from accounts that required 2 signatures. It was not, the specialist confirmed, the Duchess's actual signature. She had been in Harrowfield when those documents were signed. Alara Finch spoke for 10 minutes, from memory, without notes. She had offered to bring the clinical record, but Holloway had said he preferred her account presented orally for the room, with the written record submitted as a separate exhibit. She described Isolde's clinical presentation on arrival at Harrow Field, the diagnostic documentation she had inherited from Dr. Prewitt, and the specific discrepancies between those documents and what she had observed. She described the chemical properties of the henbane compound she had identified in the tonic preparation, its known neurological effects, and the trajectory of Isolde's recovery once the compound was no longer administered. She was not a dramatic speaker. She was precise and even and absolutely devastatingly clear, and the precision of her words had the effect of making everything she described more horrible, not less, because there was no softening agent of emotion, only facts, placed one after another like stones in a wall that was being built right in front of the room. When she finished, the ballroom was very quiet. An older gentleman near the back murmured something to his companion. A woman in blue began, very quietly, to cry. Alaric was looking at the floor. He had not looked up since Alara began speaking. Wren Cobley was not in the room. She was in a hotel 2 streets away, waiting by the telephone. But her statement was. Tobias read it aloud, which was not strictly necessary given that it existed as a written exhibit, but which was, Isolde understood, a deliberate choice. He wanted the room to hear Wren's voice in the words, the particular economy and honesty of a woman who sewed for a living and had carried a secret for 2 years because she had no one with sufficient power to receive it until now. He read, the morning she had taken the bottle to Aldous Percy, what Percy had told her, the 36 hours that followed, and the morning she had found her position terminated and her belongings in a bag outside her room. He read her final sentence, which she had written in the same careful script as the rest. I want it to be known that I did not leave my post voluntarily. I was removed because I had discovered something, and I believe my employer knew what I had discovered and acted accordingly. He set the statement down. The room had nothing left to say. It had been said. All of it had been said clearly and completely and in front of every person who had the power to make sure that it could never be unsaid. Alaric did not break in the way that people in stories break. No collapse, no outburst, no dramatic moment of disintegration. He broke in a smaller, more accurate way. His composure simply ran out. It did not run out all at once, but in increments, visible to anyone watching closely enough, as the evidence accumulated and the space around him contracted. The space that power makes, the invisible perimeter of authority that the powerful carry with them into every room. That space was gone now. He was standing in the ballroom of Caldermore Palace, in a room of 800 people, and he was simply a man in a very expensive coat who had done terrible things and been found out. And the perimeter that should have protected him had dissolved. And without it, he was not a duke at all. He was just a person, and the person was frightened. He said to Holloway, in a voice with nothing left to manage it, I would like to speak with my solicitor in private. Bramwell, who had gone gray, looked at the floor. He was thinking about the countersignature. He was thinking about the documents he had helped process. He was thinking about the specific legal meaning of the word accessory. Holloway said evenly, in due course, Your Grace. They arrested him at 11:15, when the formal questioning at the scene was concluded, and the documentation had been transferred to Holloway's custody. The constables, who had been waiting in the lobby, came forward, and Holloway gave the formal caution in a voice that carried clearly enough for the nearest 50 people to hear every word. Alaric did not speak. He did not look at Isolde. He looked at a point somewhere above everyone's heads as the constables positioned themselves beside him. And then he walked with them toward the main doors, and the crowd parted for him as it had parted for Isolde earlier, but differently. The parting for Isolde had been shock, recognition, the adjustment of a room to the presence of someone who should not have been there and was. The parting for Alaric was something else. The instinctive drawing back of people who have realized they have been in proximity to something dangerous and are only now understanding the danger has passed. The main doors opened. He went through them. The doors closed. The room let out a breath. Somewhere in the musicians' gallery above, as if the instruments had a sense of timing, the string quartet began again. Tentatively, a quiet piece in a minor key. Almost, but not quite, like the evening had been ordinary all along. The trial of Duke Alaric Vane lasted 4 weeks, was reported in every major newspaper in England and Scotland, and produced a verdict that, when it came in on a cold Thursday afternoon in November, felt to Isolde neither like triumph nor like closure. It felt like the end of a very long chapter of a book she had been forced to write. And the first morning after the verdict, she sat at the kitchen table of Cormac's Norfolk estate, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and thought about what it was like to be finished with a thing, and to have no task left to complete. The charges had been multiple, and had been prosecuted methodically, without drama, in the manner of a case that had sufficient evidence and required only careful presentation rather than persuasion. Fraud, in the first instance. The systematic diversion of estate funds over a period of 6 years. The total confirmed at a number that produced audible reactions in the public gallery each day it was mentioned. The unlawful committal of a person under fraudulent medical documentation. The filing of a false death certificate. The forgery of a countersignature on financial documents. Each charge was supported by the evidence Tobias had assembled, and each was, in the end, confirmed by the jury in under 3 hours. Alaric was sentenced on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the verdict. The sentence was 12 years. Dr. Prewitt, who had been found at a boarding house in Calais 3 weeks after the ball and returned to England under formal extradition proceedings, received 8 years. Grafton, the estate manager, had cooperated with the prosecution's investigation and received a reduced sentence of 5 years, with a recommendation for early review on account of his cooperation. The Edinburgh solicitor associated with the Ralston accounts received 7 years. Bramwell, Alaric's solicitor, was disbarred and referred for separate criminal proceedings. Wren received a formal apology from the court, unusual, Tobias said, but appropriate, and a financial settlement negotiated as part of the civil proceedings, which ran parallel to the criminal case. The settlement included compensation for wrongful dismissal and damages for the harm she had suffered as a direct result of her dismissal. It was not enough, Isolde thought, for what Wren had carried for 2 years with no one watching and no one asking. But it was something. It was the system doing what it could, which was not everything but was not nothing. She had learned, in the past 2 years, to separate those two things. They were not the same. She accepted the first and worked to close the gap. The estate returned to her in January, legally, formally, under the management of a trustee Tobias had installed during the criminal proceedings, who had done a preliminary audit of the accounts and confirmed that the situation, while serious, was not irreparable. The tenant cottages in the South Field that had been listed in the diverted maintenance funds, but never repaired, were still standing, barely. Their roofs had developed the kind of damage that comes from several years of Yorkshire weather and no attention. But they were fixable. The tenant families who lived in them had, for the most part, stayed. When Isolde's first letter as reinstated Duchess arrived at the estate agent's office in late January, explaining that she would be returning to Ashenvale Hall in February and requesting a full accounting of the estate's current condition, the estate agent had forwarded it to the tenants who had remained, and 3 families had written back. Their letters were practical, carefully worded, unsentimental in the way of people who have learned not to trust promises easily. They described what needed doing. They did not ask whether she intended to stay. She wrote back on the same day she received each letter. She told them she intended to stay. She told them what she would fix first. She told them when she would arrive. She kept every promise. Alara Finch returned to Edinburgh in February to the position at the Royal Infirmary she had held before Harrowfield, which had been preserved for her by a senior colleague who had, upon reading the newspaper coverage of the trial, decided that his original instinct about Dr. Finch's quality had been vindicated on a scale he had not anticipated. She and Isolde parted at King's Cross Station on a gray February morning. Ilara for Edinburgh, Isolde for Hampshire. And the farewell was not long. Ilara was not a person who was good at sustained farewell. "You will write," Isolde said. It was not a question. "I will write," Ilara confirmed. They embraced briefly. Then Ilara picked up her case and walked toward her platform with her usual compact efficiency. And Isolde watched her go and felt the particular tenderness that attaches to the people who see us at our worst and stay anyway. Cormac was beside her, his arm through hers, and he patted her hand without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. Seraphine Colt had accepted a posting abroad with a cousin's diplomatic mission. She had not commented on the trial in any public venue. Isolde wished her nothing, neither good nor ill, simply nothing. She arrived at Ashenvale Hall on the 14th of February, which she had not planned and which struck her when she noticed the date as either fate or coincidence, and she had decided during the past 2 years that she no longer believed in either. She had driven herself. Cormac had offered to come, and she had told him she needed to do this alone. And he had understood because he always understood what she meant before she finished saying it. The drive through Hampshire was long and quiet. Bare trees against a winter sky. The road familiar in the way of things you have carried in your memory for so long that the real version seems slightly smaller than the one inside you. She turned through the gates of Ashenvale Hall at 3 in the afternoon, when the light was already going. That early amber gray that February gives you before taking it back almost immediately. The drive was lined with bare elms. The house was at the end of it, just as she remembered. The stone facade, the tall windows, the particular proportions of a building that has been standing long enough to have absorbed everyone who ever lived in it. She stopped the motor car. She sat for a moment. Then she got out. She walked through the front door alone. Mrs. Ballow was there. She had stayed through everything, which was not surprising. She was that kind of woman. And behind her, the housekeeper was visibly, privately, composing herself with the determination of someone who has decided not to cry and intends to hold that decision. Isolde shook her hand. She did not cry either, not in the entrance hall. She walked through the house room by room, not looking for what was wrong or different, but simply being in each room in turn. The entrance hall, the drawing room, the library, the morning room with its view of the bare garden where the roses were nothing but dark stems in the February cold. She did not hurry. She had not hurried anything in 2 years, and she was not about to start. In each room, she paused long enough to remember it, to let the gap between the room she had carried in her memory and the room she was standing in close slowly, the way gaps close when both sides stop pulling. The rooms smelled of old wood and beeswax polish and the particular cool air of a stone house in winter. They smelled of a place she had come from, a place she had come back to. Hers. She stopped last in the library, which was where she had confronted Alaric with her notes on that Tuesday evening in March, which was where she had watched the paper curl and blacken in the fireplace, which was where, in a different version of her life, everything had ended. She stood at the window that looked out over the south field and the tenant cottages beyond, the ones with the damaged roofs, visible even from here as a slight wrongness in the silhouette of the buildings against the winter sky. She would start there. That was the first task. She would get the roofs repaired and the drainage sorted and the accounts in proper order. And she would do it as herself, visibly with her name on every document and her presence at every meeting and her voice in every decision. No hiding, no managing from the shadows, no performing the role of a woman whose presence is most valued when it leaves no trace of effort. She put her hand on the window glass, the way she had put her hand on the cottage window the morning after her escape, pressing her palm flat against the cold, feeling the house push back. The library fire was lit. Its warm glow fell across the window glass and turned the February garden amber for one moment. She turned from the window. She sat at the desk. She picked up a pen. She began.